So yesterday there were a bunch of primaries in Ohio, in North Carolina, and Indiana. It is highly likely you did not hear much about them. Among other reasons, that may be because those elections did not fit the Beltway media political narrative of 2010. That narrative is pretty simply and incredibly consistent. It goes like this. You can't win in this political climate unless you are an anti-establishment candidate at the least, and a Tea Party candidate if possible. According to everyone whose zip code starts with 200, in both parties, it's insurgent candidates with non-traditional backgrounds who are going to be upending incumbents all over the country, left and right. And that's a great story as long as you don't look at the actual news. The actual facts. In Ohio's Democratic Senate primary, for example, the candidate backed by the state and national party defeated the Democrat who was running to his left. In North Carolina's incumbent Republican Senator Richard Burr drew 3 primary challengers. He ended up winning 80% of the vote. But the prototype for this anti-incumbent common wisdom could be found in none other than the great state of Indiana. There you had the ultimate Republican insider, a former senator turned Uber lobbyist, Dan Coates, running against the, for lack of a better term, the Tea Party candidate, Marlin Stutzman. Now, before we all say Marlin, Martin, who, Stutz, who, let me remind you of Senator Jim DeMint. Senator Jim DeMint, Republican of South Carolina, and the man behind the Senate Conservatives Fund. The mission of that fund is to elect conservatives to the United States Senate, not just to help them poll better than they otherwise would have without his help, not just to raise lots of money for them. The goal is to elect them. Senator DeMint is responsible for propping up the candidacy of Mr. Stutzman. According to a statement by Senator DeMint today, his fund raised more than $200,000 for the failed candidate, Mr. Stutzman, in the last 2 weeks alone. You will recall again that Mr. Stutzman lost to the establishment guy, Dan Coates. Senator DeMint's record as an electoral soothsayer is not merely 0 for 1. He should be so lucky. Senator DeMint also has that infamous New York congressional race to not boast about, New York 23. Senator DeMint backed the Tea Party guy, Doug Hoffman, who, despite flash-in-the-pan media coverage, lost that one too. Actually, the Democrat ended up winning that one after Senator DeMint got involved. Good going, Senator DeMint. Back in Washington, Senator DeMint also took the lead on a policy issue that's being promoted as a huge electoral winner for Republicans and conservatives by party leaders like Newt Gingrich.
Every Republican running in 10 and again in 12 will run on an absolute pledge to repeal this bill.
Everyone's going to run on this. Everyone's going to run on this. Hours after President Obama signed health reform into law, it was Senator DeMint who introduced a bill to repeal it. So far, he's got not a majority of Republican senators to sign up as his co-sponsors. He's only got 20, even though the Republican minority leader on the House side said it was going to be his #1 priority. So is it possible? Is there any way that you're not hearing about the conservative insurgent candidate anti-incumbent faceplant yesterday because it doesn't fit the narrative? Because it's a square peg and the actual political environment is a round hole? A round whole lot of politics as usual? Joining us now is Washington Post columnist Ezra Klein. Ezra, thanks very much for being here.
Good evening.
So Jim DeMint wants to be a kingmaker in bringing up insurgent conservative candidates against mainstream Republican candidates. The Beltway media has sort of celebrated his efforts in this regard. Do you think they have been oversold?
Well, maybe. You can take it 2 ways, right? Certainly he has not been very successful at knocking off incumbent candidates. What he and others have been successful at doing, though, is getting incumbent candidates to be very afraid of being challenged by Tea Partiers, challenged from the right. And one thing about a primary is if what you're trying to do is change the way the Republicans in the Senate and in the Congress vote, you don't need to win that many of them. You need to make them afraid of being primaried. And that much is working. You may have Senator Bob Bennett lose his primary in Utah. And, you know, you've had Coates in Indiana. I think he only won with 40% of the vote. People don't want to go through that. So they say, you know what? They tell their chief of staff, don't let that happen to me. We're going to vote the way that we need to vote such that we don't get that primary. And then you might have sensible Republicans, but they're not voting like them.
Doesn't a strategy like that depend on the appearance, though, of Jim DeMint and other sort of insurgent stokers' effectiveness? That his press, essentially, his effectiveness at selling himself as a kingmaker is more important than his ability to pull it off, as long as nobody knows that he might be more bark than bite.
In theory, although I wouldn't say politicians are exactly the bravest species of man. You know, they don't want trouble, right? They like the quiet life to some degree. And if they are going into what's going to be a tough election anyway, they don't want to take their primary from the right. I've really been surprised doing a lot of this reporting how often you will get the rationale from someone when you're asking why they're doing something that, look, they've got a primary. I mean, Chuck Grassley, a very safe guy in Iowa. And he sort of went much further to the right during the health care reform debate than people expected. He eventually began sort of parroting the death panel's nonsense. And the explanation you got from pretty much everybody was he's getting challenged from the right. And you say, well, how can he lose? He's an institution in Iowa. Then you look at John McCain, and then you look at Bob Bennett, and you say, you know, you don't need too many of these guys who are institutions to lose for everybody to be afraid it will be them next. It doesn't need to be likely for it to be them next, but if it's a 1 in 10 chance, that's still a 1 in 10 chance, and they vote to make sure they're not the one.
I guess the more likely, the more easily scared you are, the less actually scary the threat has to be.
Right.
Is there a Jim DeMint equivalent on the left, or are there efforts on the left to try to move policy to the left through primary threats the way that DeMint has?
Left is not as aggressive about primaries, at least at this juncture. I mean, one thing, of course, is the left is in governance mode, so that induces sort of a different road to compromise. I've always thought the Rosetta Stone to understanding Jim DeMint is a comment he made a number of months back, where he said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but quite closely, he said, I would prefer 30 true conservatives to 60, essentially, Republicans who aren't true conservatives. And when you're saying that, what you're saying is that I would prefer to have a pure party as opposed to a governing coalition that can move policy in my direction but would have to make the sort of dirty, messy, frustrating, and annoying compromises that governance tends to require of you. That works, I think, when you're in the opposition. It's a great way to sort of get people on your side. It's a great way to fire up the base. When you get into power, it doesn't, A, it is hard to get into power based on that, but B, when you get into power, it leaves you very painted. It leaves you painted into a corner. It becomes very unclear what you can do without breaking faith with the people who brought you there, because you promise them a type of purity that governance does not allow for.
That said, I'm sure Democrats would be delighted to help Jim DeMint to his dream of 30
Sure.
Republican senators if they could.
It's the one thing Democrats and Jim DeMint agree totally on.
Exactly. Ezra Klein, columnist for the Washington Post. It's always great to have you here, Ezra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel.